Shall we continue? We left off here. Blank slide. Or did we? Anyway, before we move on to the next slide, I wanted to say the following. Napoleon really ruled over and put into place a military dictatorship, not as dictatorial or harshly dictatorial as we'll see in the 20th century dictatorships. Nonetheless, it wasn't a democracy, but or anything even close to it. But he took pains to make it appear like a democracy. There were a number of different elected legislatures, elected by different means in each one. He, at the beginning of his reign, offered a national plebiscite on a constitution that he had written. A plebiscite is a national vote, but not for a politician, but for an idea, a particular law. In this case, it was voting up or down the Constitution. And the numbers came out overwhelmingly for the Constitution. I mean, like 90-something%, which can't be accurate, or could it be accurate? It sounds like fraud and ballot box stuffing and all of that, and there might have been some of that as well, but I think it's more something else, and that is the public knew what was being said. The underlying message being sent was, you can either take this Constitution or have none at all. Which would you prefer? So it seems that most of the French citizens, voters, got the message. So Napoleon did understand that in the 19th century already, it was probably wise to at least pay lip service, put window dressing up to make it look like governments flowed from the public to some degree. So offers a plebiscite. Hey, I had a constitution written. You guys voted it in. What more could you want? So this, of course, is manipulative and deceptive. But nonetheless, he seems to have had, in a way ahead of his time, a feel for how modern politics would later work. One of the things that some historians now emphasize on the positive side of the ledger in evaluating Napoleon is the way that he brought modern administrative techniques and organizational systems to France, and also to the countries that he conquered, and then set up his own puppet governments, oftentimes putting one of his brothers or relatives in command or on the throne of countries, but then tended to force the same kind of centralizing administrative bureaucratic reforms that did create, in some cases, much better governing systems, much better civil service, and so forth. So one writer has said, Napoleon created the agencies of centralized administration and the administrators to run them. These included the gendarmerie, police, the state-controlled paramilitary police force, the prefect, the head of departmental administration appointed by the central government and accountable exclusively to it, a cadre of trained experts for the state, products of the École Polytechnique. My French pronunciation is terrible these days. Founded in 1794, new state-run secondary schools, the lycées, which are like new types of high school in those days, whose curriculum centered on Latin and mathematics. So he was even greatly concerned about training and educating, very talented people with lots of skills, providing a very good education for civil servants, which sounds like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised at how few countries were really taking that kind of approach and taking this seriously as Napoleon that long ago. Francis Fukuyama, political scientist at Stanford, talks about the importance of administration in a couple of his latest books. He says, a modern state is impersonal. State administration does not consist of the ruler's family and friends, though in Napoleon's case, that part was somewhat different. Rather, recruitment to administrative positions is based on impersonal criteria such as merit, education, or technical knowledge. So Napoleon violated this principle at the very top, putting, again, brothers and other family members on thrones, but underneath them, some of the most important civil servants, administrators, department heads were people that were there because of their knowledge, their merit, education. Remember, Napoleon had advanced as a man with merit and talent, and not because of any kind of reputation or connections, family or otherwise. Fukuyama goes on to say there's always a need for expanding islands of autonomous technocratic competence within government. That statement means a lot of things, but among them, it does mean that it's important to have good technocrats in government. If you don't, you're going to have a multitude of problems. So Napoleon did not only do this in France, but he did export it by force to other countries. This is the main area in which he got some praise from some leaders of countries that he conquered, saying, "Yeah, when okay, he came in, and took us over by force, bloodshed, warfare, etc." Not that they loved that, but after he left us with a much more sound political, economic system, etc. When Napoleon first got to power, he realized that the Catholic Church was a problem for him and for France. Remember, the French Revolutionary government had angered the Catholic Church through the civil constitution of the clergy, forcing clergymen in France to take an oath of loyalty to the revolutionary government, and a massive confiscation of church property. So I didn't mention the Pope specifically, but you could, I think, extrapolate from that last lecture that the Pope and the Catholic Church hierarchy was not happy about these developments, and that they weren't. To make it worse, the French revolutionaries, as the conflict got more radical, tried to do away with religion altogether in France. Tried to basically make it an atheist, at least secular religious country. So Napoleon realized that it would be a good thing to do for his own power and to unify France, to get back in good standing with the church. So he actually, the government actually negotiated with the Pope an agreement, sort of a mending of fences between the two, known as the Concordat, concluded in 1801. And we see Napoleon's practical side here, also his cynical side as well, in the deal that was struck with the church. And as so often happens in Napoleon's career, when he negotiates, he tends to come away with the victory, and it's sometimes hard to even see what the other side got out of it that was worthwhile. So what did the Pope get out of this? All he really got from Napoleon was a statement declaring that Catholicism is the religion of the majority of French people, which was just stating something that was already true, though it could be seen to mean something beyond that. And the Pope may have had good reason to think, okay, that's at least enough for me to sort of bring the French back into the Catholic fold. Nonetheless, Napoleon was not doing it for religious reasons. He appears to have had not a religious bone in his body, so why did he care so much about resuscitating relations with the church? Well, again, from a practical perspective, he understood the social utility in people going to church in a country being unified religiously. Religion has always been great social glue, helping to bind societies together. And Napoleon understood this clearly. So his agreement, the Concordat with the church, had nothing to do with his own belief in religion, nothing to do with wanting to save the souls of the French people. He did it for strictly political reasons. Understood the social utility of church, religion. Now we get to Napoleon's brilliant military career, and this is what he's most famous for today. One recent biography of Napoleon by Andrew Roberts, an excellent book, a British historian who does take a rather pro-Napoleon approach. He's on the side of those scholars that think Napoleon has been criticized far too much. But it's an extraordinarily detailed and extremely well-written biography. And he calculates, Roberts that is, that Napoleon's military record was 55-7 when all was said and done. Now, he understood, and I think he made references to it in the book. I read it a few years ago, I forget specifically, but he understood that you can't actually say a military leader's record was 55-7 like it was a basketball team or something. But he does establish a criteria for what counts as a battle, what doesn't count as a battle, and comes up with a figure that's not intended to be exact, because most historians don't deal with records of, again, generals, like we do the sports teams. But he's just trying to give a general feel for Napoleon's astonishing success. So a 55-7 record, if that's even close to accurate, he won 55 times out of 62, is impressive indeed. A famous picture of Napoleon reviewing his troops. He understood something else as well, that given the situation in France on the heels of the revolution, given that he was a military dictator, most people, I think, saw through the facade of democracy or republic institutions that were established. And he recognized then that for him to stay popular, and as a guy who I said already understood how important it was becoming in the modern world to have the public on your side, at least to appease the masses of people, he realized it was his military success and prowess that was the key to keeping himself in power. That if he stopped producing military victories, there was a real possibility that he would fall. Also, a more obvious part of that is that if he lost to the other countries fighting against him, he'd be likely taken out of power by them. So that was that was obvious for everyone to see. But his insight on the former idea was, I think, true, but a bit more subtle. The keys to Napoleon's military success, there are many of them. I don't always go through all these, but I will. He understood the advantage of surprise and speed. Another thing that seems obvious today, but you'd be surprised in the 18th century or early 19th how revolutionary that was. He consistently used deception, which is also, it wasn't brand new, of course, but he used it often and well. One of the most interesting features of his, recipe for success was that Napoleon seemed to have a genius-level understanding of geography, topography, and reading maps. Andrew Roberts' biography, aforementioned, talks a lot about this. And this is to say that Napoleon could look at a map and understand it better than most people because he understood what it meant for, to have a road through a forested, mountainous area in a way that most people probably didn't. And so he could see a map in a much more full-blown way, in a much more textured way than most people, because he was gifted at reading them. It also helped that he had people, reconnaissance units, do meticulous research. So if they were sent to check out a road where it led and all that, they would be tasked with coming back with all kinds of detailed information: how wide the road was, what it consisted of, what was on the side of the roads, what the weather was like, and on and on and on. So Napoleon's troops rarely went somewhere where they didn't have the best knowledge and information available to them, which was a key to success. He understood the effectiveness and importance of mixed unit fighting as it became known. Again, to us today, this seems, just like a no-brainer, like a duh. But mixed unit fighting meant how to mix and most effectively have infantry, cavalry, and artillery in those days fight together, and for maximum strength. Units needed to be in support of each other, which is a modern, commonly known technique. But he had all kinds of different methods of doing this, and some rather innovative ones as well. So where units were placed in proximity to others in the his army, he was extremely gifted at doing that as well. He used speech, words brilliantly to motivate his troops in writing and in person. That's where you can see some of the charisma come in. A couple of cases that were famous. Morale speeches that he gave to the troops, which may be overstated somewhat, but I think it did have, there is something to it. He paid keen attention to detail, logistics. We actually have dozens and dozens of letters that survive of him writing about shoes. This is the kind of detail and the kind of work ethic that the guy employed. Surely Napoleon could have, and most military leaders would, delegate sort of supplies of shoes for the soldiers to someone below him, even if it was one of his most important generals. A guy like this at this level wouldn't do that himself. Napoleon did, but he understood that detail and logistics were everything. That infantry, for instance, without proper footwear is in trouble, which sounds trivial, but it's not. It really isn't. So he understood which details were of the necessity, and he made sure that he got what he wanted. He generally knew more than his opponents, emphasized intelligence gathering. So most of these things seem like nothing new to us, but we have to remember the time period. We have to put ourselves in the shoes of someone living in, say, 1805 or 1810. Many of these things were known, but they weren't done consistently, regularly, brilliantly, as the French did them under Napoleon. He did know when to delegate and when to take over. So he could delegate authority at times. Many of his generals or marshals, the highest rank in his military, were only good under Napoleon's leadership as generals, marshals. A couple of them showed the capacity and proved it on the battlefield to win battles themselves without Napoleon even being there, but most of them faltered when Napoleon wasn't around. And finally, Napoleon could always see the Schwerpunkt, which is a German word, of course, that comes later on, but it sort of means the same thing still. It's sort of the key point. Punkt is point on the battlefield. So kind of the centering point, or the kind of fulcrum. So he'd sort of be able to see that kind of stuff immediately. Napoleon's one of those gifted military geniuses that could sort of beat you, in like the equivalent of like 8 chess moves. And just strategically and tactically, he was better than everyone that he faced all the time. So he couldn't get late to a battlefield because he was another part of the battlefield, and the officers in charge of this area that he just got to would be floundering, panicking, and he'd say, "Why don't you just send troops right there and take that hill?" And he would see quickly, with lightning speed, what sort of the most important spot or spots on the battlefield were. Here we have postage stamps of Napoleon's famous marshals. Ney is famous, Soult famous. They actually all are. The two that, and they're not all on here, but the two that showed capacity to, on their own, to command without Napoleon ahead of them is Davao on the left, and lower left Murat, who was this very young, dashing cavalry officer, but of someone with great talent. Napoleon's first big-time military campaign on his own was in Egypt. This is after he had, during the French Revolution, or the winding down years, the Directory after the Revolution, when he first became a general, he was sent to fight on the Italian front against the Austrians in that war that had been started back in 1792. And he routed the Austrian forces in northern Italy again and again and again, and came up with an astoundingly beneficial peace treaty for France. And it's from there that the leaders saw, wow, this guy is unbelievably gifted. So he talked the government into a military campaign in Egypt, and of course with him at the head of it. The idea was that Egypt was of immense strategic importance to the British, which it was. and as we know, Great Britain and France were each other's main rivals. So he thought we can strike a blow at the British Empire, Britain itself, by taking control of Egypt, which the British didn't have colonial control over at that point. It became a colony later on, but it was still of strategic importance to them. That would be true more after the Suez Canal was built. But nonetheless, Napoleon was correct in seeing the eastern Mediterranean and Egypt as a strategic spot of the greatest importance, from the British military strategic perspective. However, after a dramatic and one-sided victory at what became known as the Battle of the Pyramids, see a rendition of this here now. They weren't fighting that close to the pyramids, so this picture, like many of Napoleon's battles and portraits, is taking some liberties. But he did wipe out the enemy forces at this battle. It's just that none of the rest of the campaign went well after this. He got bogged down there, staying there for months and months, and really wasn't able to achieve his or the French goals, and eventually went home on his own to get back to Paris quickly, and left most of his troops there to fend for themselves, some of whom never made it home, either dying or being captured, or deciding to stay where they were, scattering in various places. So he showed the capacity to, when push came to shove, ditch his troops, and we'll see him do that again on a bigger stage later on. But one of the reasons I think Napoleon left so quickly on his own, as rotten a thing as it was to do, he understood politically that this campaign has overall been a disaster. If I don't get back home quickly, if I don't get to Paris before the news of this, this overall defeat gets there, or soon thereafter, I might be out of power by the time I come back into town. So he wanted to get back there so he could put his own kind of spin on the overall failed military campaign that he just spent months on. And what the French, it worked. What the French tended to know or remember was the Battle of the Pyramids, the very first part of the campaign and the only part that was successful. And this battle had been wildly successful. So we see Napoleon's gift for propaganda, for political spin, for political maneuvering in a modern way, as unethical or amoral as it may be. In 1805, with Napoleon already as emperor now, so he's commanding troops in the field as well as running the country, the Battle of Trafalgar took place. He wasn't present because he wasn't a naval officer or general. And if Napoleon had a military weakness in terms of his thinking, it was naval strategy. He didn't understand the Navy very well, and he tended to underestimate its importance. The French had a large, powerful fleet, second only to the British, but nonetheless Napoleon sort of downplayed the importance of navies, which was a mistake. So he was far from perfect. No leader is ever perfect. And at Trafalgar, sure enough, not completely because of Napoleon's lack of interest in naval warfare, the British struck a major blow to the French fleet in one of the most famous naval battles in all of Western history, and in British history, maybe the most famous one. Lord Horatio Nelson, commander of the British fleet, a British hero already, became a much bigger hero from this battle forward, because they won the battle, and Nelson was mortally wounded in the process. As the battle was ending, he was alive just long enough to know that his fleet had basically won and died on board ship. And so when you die in a heroic victory, you're turned even into more of a hero. And you can see that anytime you go to London today, because Trafalgar Square, named after this battle, has a statue or a column that's called Nelson's Column, one of the main tourist areas or sections of all of London. So, but our main point here is that Napoleon, if he didn't recognize it already, and I think he did, knew that his main antagonist and the main thorn in his side was going to be Great Britain. I mean, again, it wasn't hard to know that, since that had been true for a couple centuries now anyway. But if he had sort of doubted it, or forgot the British, or underestimated them, this dissuaded him quickly. Napoleon's forces and his leadership, and just France's overall economic, demographic power. France, as I said earlier, was the largest country population-wise west of Russia. All that together made them a potent force in battle, at least in land warfare. To show us how potent this was, every time that throughout the duration of Napoleon's time in power, between roughly 1800 and 1815, there were a number of coalitions. You see the third coalition on the upper right here, which means alliances. Remember, we've talked about the balance of power, and when one country becomes too powerful and tries to tip the balance of power, what tends to happen is the other countries balance against it, form alliances, coalitions, to put the offending country back in the box. That's exactly what's happening here. But Napoleon and France were so difficult to handle that not only did they conquer much of Western and Central Europe before they were sort of turned back, it took several coalitions to defeat them. So when you see third, fourth, fifth coalition here, this is means that they tried once before, 4 times before, 5 times before, to ally with each other and defeat Napoleon, and failed. So it's a good way to remember or see how effective the Napoleonic forces actually were. His signature victory in battle, and great generals usually are accorded a signature victory by posterity. So historians look back at this was his masterpiece of a battle. For Robert E. Lee, for instance, in the American Civil War, it's usually seen as the Battle of Chancellorsville. For Napoleon, it's clearly Austerlitz, a blowout victory over combined Russian and Austrian forces that led to the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire had been around for centuries and centuries, was no more when Napoleon got to the other side of this battle and this military campaign that saw the Austrians drop out of the coalition, although they'll come back in one of the other ones later on. Napoleon was so good in sort of one battle, one campaign, that what he tended to have happen and get used to a fault eventually, is he'd sort of pick one of the major, most powerful countries in the coalition against him, send all of his forces, or almost all of them, at that country's forces as quickly as possible, knock them out of the war, get them to sign a separate peace, sort of basically defying their allies and saying, we're going to split from them, getting what he wanted, and getting them to go home. And then he'd have a much easier time with one of the major powers, off the battlefield, back home. At Jena and Auerstadt, 1806, in the Fourth Coalition, he defeated Prussia again, which was humiliating. Remember, Prussia is the country that was kind of an upstart, getting into the top 5 major powers in Europe, as we've already talked about. Frederick the Great being the most brilliant commander there previous century, and winning legendary victories in the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. So Prussia its whole reputation was based on military prowess and success. Its value system was based on sort of military values and military glory. So for them to get defeated twice in a row by Napoleon was utter humiliation for a country that was so enamored with things military. This then set off a wave of reform in Prussian society, not just military reform, that too, but also educational reform, more attention to science, better organized government, political reform, etc. Sweeping changes across the board, because they're seeing this Napoleonic-led France were not a match for it. So to keep from going under, we're going to have to improve. It's a good example of something else we've talked about. I know I keep bringing up things we've already talked about, but that's part of what we do in history, is sort of connect dots, find similarities back and forth through time that help us understand sort of both places, then and later, or then and now. So remember, we talked about the importance and the explanatory power of the European state system, and how having a bunch of relatively small to medium-sized countries or kingdoms crammed together on this little peninsula, western peninsula part of Asia, is partly what explains European success, technologically, militarily, scientifically, because there's just intense competition, much of it military, but as you see here, the things that are militarily, that make you militarily competitive, are not just your troops and the weapons you have, but your economy, your educational institutions, etc. So this is a good example of the European competitive state system, which forced everyone to put as much thought and effort and energy, resources into improvement, innovation in every area as much as possible. At Friedland in 1807, Napoleon annihilated Russian forces, causing Tsar Alexander I to sign the Treaty of Tilsit, dropping out of the Fourth Coalition. So again, by this time Napoleon is used to this. Knocks out one country quickly, and then has an easier time with the rest. And they are willing to sign a separate peace, ditching the other allies. At Varm in 1809, the Fifth Coalition sees Napoleon being crushed one more time, though in this case it was an exceptional bloody battle on all sides, 80,000 casualties, partly because of 1,000 artillery pieces on the ground. In those days, having 1,000 cannons in one battle was an extraordinarily large number, with 300,000 soldiers packed onto one battlefield. So the casualties were extraordinarily high because of the amount of high-powered weaponry and how many troops were kind of crammed close together. So this was a costly win, and by 1809, Napoleonic France, Napoleon's military, was showing signs of weakening somewhat. They couldn't replace manpower by this time, though winning again and again. They're winning big battles, which always take the toll even on the winning side. So Napoleon had lost so many soldiers by now that he not only couldn't replace them right, in terms of just bodies, but he certainly couldn't replace the expertise and experience. When it was officers, that's even more so. This also tells us, which is predictable, that he was going to have to, and by this time he already was, tap some of the places he conquered and force troops from Italy and other places outside of France that were under French control into his armies. We start to see that more and more. So by 1809, the European strategic situation looked something like this. In all those areas, basically with a black line drawn around, with interior black lines too, Napoleon either had already conquered or made some sort of deal that they agreed to sort of act under his authority as an ally without causing any problems. The Continental System, as it became known, was Napoleon's attempt to do naval warfare, although in a different way. He was mainly using his navy to make economic warfare on Great Britain and the other allies. So since he controlled all the areas in the blue, and there's a lot of coastline there in blue, some of which is France, but some of it not, he leaned on all those places and forced them, not perfectly, some of them didn't want to and got out from under it, or at least eventually, but forced them to give up trading with the British, to try to hit the British economy hard by slowing down its trade by a considerable margin. However, since the British, as we know, had the supreme navy in the world, they just countered by blockading French ports, and so it put a crimp in both countries' economies, and so it wasn't necessarily an advantage for Napoleon. In fact, it might have been a loss. It's hard to measure it to this day. It certainly wasn't. It didn't turn out the way Napoleon had intended to, not even close. The biggest, I think, the first big sign that Napoleon's prowess, not his skills or ability, but just the ability of France to kind of continue to win as it kind of continues to take on more responsibilities. As they invade more and more countries, they're spread too thin. So there are a lot of problems that aren't about Napoleon's talents being drained away, but France's resources being drained away. It's the campaign in Spain and Portugal that really shows the wear and tear that his armies and military efforts had been taking on the whole army, on the whole country. The Peninsular Campaign, as it's sometimes called, famously written about in a number of very popular a series of historical fiction, very worthwhile reading. The debacle in Spain happened after Napoleon's forces had defeated the Spanish armies in large-scale battles and basically obliterated them. So how could we be saying that France, this was sort of the first crack, as it says on the screen, in Napoleon's legend of invincibility? Well, the Spanish, and to some degree the Portuguese, on the Iberian Peninsula both, just started fighting the war by different means. They no longer had the capability to fight set-piece battles, lots of troops going head-to-head against lots of troops on the other side. So they resorted to guerrilla warfare. And guerrilla warfare, which means hit and run, surprise attacks, ambushes, this kind of thing, hitting supply depots, assassinations of leaders, picking at the heels of the other side, is very hard to combat. It's sometimes referred to as asymmetrical warfare because one side seems like it's hardly fighting at all because they don't have very many troops, and they're never, or almost never, putting lots of troops in the battlefield at any one time. In this case, they didn't have them. And the other side has these massive, powerful military forces, heavily armed with the latest high-tech weapons. So it would seem very one-sided, very asymmetrical in favor of the larger, more high-tech army. But that's not always the case, especially if the side that's using, and maybe only, if the side that's using guerrilla tactics and techniques is on the defensive. In this case, the Spanish are on the defensive because it's their country that's being invaded. Because much like the American revolutionaries did under George Washington and the Continental Army, and they didn't fight a guerrilla war out and out, but George Washington and his generals understood the idea behind guerrilla warfare, which is if we just stay at this and keep frustrating the other side again and again and again, and they eventually go home, we get what we want. We win because we're fighting to defend our territory. So in the Americans' case, they were fighting for independence too, but by getting the British to go home, they would secure their independence, and did. This is what the Spanish eventually did. They already had their independence, but they didn't beat the French in any major military victories, but they just wore them down, a couple casualties at a time, a couple bombs at a time, a couple ambushes at a time, nitpicking at the heels day after day after day, and grinding down the morale and the resources of French troops, and they did. Both sides got incredibly frustrated. This is one of two famous paintings from the Spanish painter Goya, depicting brutality and executions of Spanish guerrillas or Spanish civilians, probably in some cases. So a long, brutal campaign, which showed, as it says at the bottom, fighting against a guerrilla enemy. And so Napoleon never was successful in Spain and eventually did have to give up the effort there. It's true, however, that the British did send a military force to fight alongside of Spain, so that's part of the reason for the victory as well. It's not just the Spanish guerrilla tactics and techniques. The British, actually under the Duke of Wellington, who comes back later on, were pretty successful fighting with their Spanish allies. Napoleon never actually went to Spain either. So one could say, well, if Napoleon had been there, it might have been a different story, which could be true. But it doesn't seem likely that this probably wasn't about Napoleon, or Napoleon's own genius probably wasn't enough to really take hold of the situation in Spain. Well, who wants to invade Russia? the answer is Napoleon does. And actually the answer is many people have, but as you probably already know, it's not really a good idea. So, but Napoleon did so, possibly because of ego. Certainly he underestimated Russia and the Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, who he defeated and forced to sign the Treaty of Tilsit, which we talked about. From that point forward, I think he thought he had the upper hand on Alexander, had him intimidated. What he didn't know is Alexander was chomping at the bit, quietly waiting for revenge, and couldn't wait to break that treaty and fight Napoleon, and was determined to beat him. So he thought he kind of had Alexander cowed, and nothing could be further from the truth. This chart shows the military campaign from about 6 different pieces of data, and some have called this the greatest chart, sort of graphic illustration in history. A guy named Charles Minard, who did this like in the 1880s. So he wasn't around during Napoleon's campaigns, a Frenchman, but he studied the campaign in Russia and sort of did this chart. And so the point is, many think it's the greatest piece of visual illustration ever done, because in one simple page you can learn an awful lot, and I'm not going to go into the details here, about the campaign and why it failed so disastrously, spectacularly in the end. And so if Spain had been a crack in French armor, this was a disaster. And the brown line at the tan line at the top is the size of Napoleon's army going in to Russia, all the way to Moscow, and the black or brown line is the size of the army going out. So just that alone gives you an indication of how much of a beating Napoleon's forces took in many ways. There's the temperature, because Napoleon got stuck in Moscow in the winter. So another lesson that everyone's learned seemingly by now, you don't want to invade Russia at all, and certainly you don't want to be there in the winter time or start too late that you're bogged down in the winter, and Napoleon did that, although he won't be the last in our class. I think you know who the other one is still to come. But there's about 4 other pieces of information in there, and if you study this carefully, as I once did, it's fascinating because it's really true. It gives you a great deal, a really pretty decent understanding of what befell French troops and Napoleon just by looking at one graph, one chart, one piece of paper. It's not a graph, it's a chart. In Russia, Napoleon won a victory in the biggest battle of this whole campaign at Borodino, defeated Russian forces, but with heavy costs. So it was a gigantic battle, and to win it, Napoleon had to throw a great deal of troops, military units, into the fray, and so he took lots of casualties, which he couldn't afford. The Russians could afford it much more. They're in their homeland. It's a much more populous country than France, even with the assistance of troops from countries that Napoleon had conquered already. So the victory at Borodino was somewhat hollow, even though Napoleon did sort of win, tactically speaking. But I think this is where we start to see his own success, cause him to not see things as clearly as he once did, or because he was used to winning. Remember, in one quick battle and campaign, or one quick campaign or battle, and then having the other side that he's fighting just come and surrender immediately. So he appears to have waited after Borodino for the Tsar, or one of the Tsar's emissaries, to show up in Moscow, which the Russians evacuated and apparently set on fire as they left. It's possible the fire was an accident. We don't know for sure, but it doesn't seem like it. It will be quite a coincidence. So the Russians were already known, and will continue to be so, for scorched earth tactics, sometimes retreating, but destroying everything that they're leaving to the enemy so they can't live off the land, making things difficult for them. So knowing that that's what the Russians often did, this, again, seems like way too much to be a coincidence. But Napoleon waited for days and days and days, about a month, in Moscow, in extremely difficult weather, or increasingly difficult weather, I should say. It's really on the way back that the weather gets, bone cold. And then realizes finally, I guess, Russia and the Tsar aren't surrendering, and he had no choice but to retreat. So he occupied Moscow, but it was the definition of a Pyrrhic victory, completely empty and hollow. And the retreat from Moscow back towards, continental Europe, which is hundreds of miles away, was absolutely horrific. The Grande Armée, as it was called, his massive army with troops from many parts of Europe along for the ride, 680,000 going in, leaving Russia about 130,000, and only about 35,000 Frenchmen got out alive. And yet, again, for the second time in our lecture, Napoleon leaves his troops to fend for themselves, gets in a sleigh, and hightails it back to Paris for the same reason, to get there to sort of political spin on this. As emperor, he was probably afraid that if he got back too late, he'd find that there was already another person sitting in his chair that had taken power from him. So, again, he shows himself to be not concerned greatly about his own troops. So, from Russia, Napoleon's empire and Napoleon's era of domination was slowly coming to an end. Things were going downhill now, pretty clearly. The Germans, who had been conquered, right, the Holy Roman Empire crushed or eviscerated, the Prussians humiliated, but many of the other smaller states, Saxony, Hanover, humiliated as well. They saw now their chance for revenge, and they're part of a coalition with the Russians and the British as well. But they counterattack and start the process of pushing French forces, Napoleon's forces, out of the various Germanies in a coordinated effort. The Germans called the Battle of Nations, the culminating conflict being the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. So this is often considered sort of the first step on the road to German unification, which still is decades into the future, but we see, at least temporarily, for military reasons, for a war, that the German states are working together and cooperating. So it is sort of a first small step towards unification. And Germany certainly gets revenge. And this sort of paved the way as well. Leipzig was another victory for the Allies, the Germans and the Allies, against Napoleon. From there, things crumbled quickly, and it wasn't too long before enemy troops were actually in Paris. Russian troops in Paris, which was shocking to everybody. So by 1814, Napoleon was done. At least it seemed like he was done. Even allies of the Russians, and the Russian Tsar Alexander, were shocked, not in a pleased way, about Russian forces ending up in Paris. Just because it's like, wow, the Russian army got all the way from Moscow to Paris, victoriously. So even their allies were kind of on notice that Russia, is a major force to be reckoned with. Everybody's afraid of the Russians going forward, partly because of this, incredible show they put on. But they did have other allies. The rest of the coalition was part of this victory as well. So Napoleon was thrown from power. The French put one of the Bourbon dynasty, the Louis, back on the throne, and tried to go back to governing as sort of a traditional monarchy. And they thought they were back on that road, and sent Napoleon off into exile on the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. And Napoleon wasn't under jail-like or prison-like conditions. He had a nice place to stay on a fairly small island. And it appears that he, right away, probably because he was a workaholic and had to keep his mind busy at all times, started reorganizing the whole island. And it was a fairly small population, but he started to become the leader and was involved in planning engineering and building projects and doing this and reforming that. But he apparently had no intention of giving up on getting back into power in France. And sure enough, after a number of months, he escaped from the island of Elba. The British had ships that were supposed to patrol around the island, kind of circling it constantly, but he slipped through their dragnet and landed on the shore of southern France in 1815. By that time, all the other major powers of Europe were meeting in Vienna at the Congress of Vienna to try to figure out how to put the map of Europe back together again after all the tumult that Napoleon's conquest had caused, what to do about France, how to punish France, etc. And in the middle of their months-long, Congress, they learn that Napoleon has escaped and is back to his old tricks again, and they have to reconvene the Congress only after Napoleon is finally vanquished for good, which still took some doing. But it's incredible. Here's where we see, I think, charisma. How else can we explain this? He landed on the southern shore of France with only a handful of followers some of whom had followed him willingly, loyally into exile on Elba. But the new French king heard about it and sent a force there to have him arrested. And they knew where he was landing, or found out where he was landing, and were right there to arrest him. And he apparently made a speech that sort of was something like, okay, if you want to arrest me, you can, but I'm your emperor, and I'm here. I've come back to bring France back to the glory that it deserves, that it once had when I was in control. And guess what? All or most of those troops basically turned around and sided with him. And news started to spread across France, and soldiers and officers started to put their uniforms back on. The call went out. Old units started to reform. Most of his marshals and generals did serve. There were a few that refused to for various reasons. But the French Napoleonic military and army was put back together once again. And oops, I went the wrong way. He fought his last campaign, sometimes referred to as the 100 Days. It was about 3 months long, coming back to power, until he was finally defeated at Waterloo in Belgium by the Duke of Wellington, British commander, with a combination of allies, in this case the British and the Prussians. So Prussia got its sweet revenge finally. In fact, the battle was somewhat nip and tuck between the British and the French, and the Prussians were marching from farther away and got there later in the day and helped, it's not the only reason, helped turn the tide of battle against Napoleon. It wasn't, I think, a certainty by any stretch that Napoleon and the French were destined to lose Waterloo, and if they had won, who knows what would have happened next. Napoleon might have been able to rebuild at least for quite a bit longer than 100 days. But nonetheless, he may have made some mistakes here. This is the only battle, his last, where I've read historians that think that Napoleon, for whatever reason, wasn't at his best here, that he did show signs of faltering. There are various explanations why that we won't get into. But this time, they sent Napoleon much further away to the island of St. Helena, which is a speck, a dot, in the middle of the southern Atlantic between Africa and South America. If you were trying to find the most remote spot on the map, and maybe that's what they were trying to do, you couldn't do much better than St. Helena. So they sent him as far away as possible this time, knowing that, knowing they couldn't try something as close to home as Elba again and get humiliated and embarrassed like they had once. You're asking yourself right now, why didn't they just execute him? It's a good question, and it happens sometimes, of course, but rulers of countries, leaders of countries, never really think it's a great idea, or usually don't think it's a great idea, to execute a foreign head of state. Why? Well, because it's a bad precedent to set, because it could boomerang back on you someday. So there's often, usually, a hesitance to do this. There was, I think, a certain amount of respect for Napoleon as well. Everybody knew he was a brilliant commander. Military men tend to respect talent on the other side in warfare, so that's probably part of it as well. But showing Napoleon's charisma, or the loyalty that he somehow exacted from his followers, there were a number of officers, his own servants that had been with him for years, government officials that willingly went with him into exile at St. Helena. And they must have had some idea what they were getting into, and that's how much loyalty he elicited, even after he'd left troops stranded twice and left them, abandoned them. So this guy somehow got a long-lived and sort of fantastic loyalty to himself. He didn't really do anything of importance on St. Helena. There was a small colony there. I think it was both British and French citizens mixed, but somewhere in the hundreds of people on this small island. It's like a rock, volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere. Napoleon had a nice, comfortable little villa there, nice yard, but for a guy that had, had Europe in the palm of his hands for the better part of a decade or more, this was little consolation, and certainly wasn't going to keep him in any way happy. So the only thing of significance that he did here was write his memoirs, which were dictated by him to one of his loyal followers. You see pictured on the right. And in his memoirs he said, "I will be remembered as a great man," which certainly shows his ego and his arrogance, which was huge. But he was also right. He has been remembered as a great man, and for good reason. He died probably of cancer. There has been some theories that he was poisoned, so there's a lot of speculation about that, but some of it might have been depression, because he just seems to have been increasingly despondent about being stuck. He must have known when he first saw St. Helena that he was not likely to ever leave that island. It looks kind of like a fortress from afar. It's this big volcanic rock with some trees on it and houses that were built. That's it. So Napoleon's career took him like a meteor to the top, and fell pretty fast as well. And Napoleon was a gifted individual all the way around, gifted with words as well. And he's good for a lot of telling or insightful historical quotes. And I forget when it was in his career, but long before his fall, he actually said, "From the top to the bottom is but a step." So you can be on the top of the world one moment, and the next moment it's all done. You've crashed. And that's basically the trajectory that his own career and life took. But the impact that he had on Europe was profound, one way or the other, good or bad, or both. Thank you.